Hello. I was asked not to read a formal paper, but to do something a little more informal and spontaneous. And so I thought I would try to do that, since I'm a rather bit of a person and tend to do what I'm told. So I've made this handout, which you can all take a look at, but I'd just like to, as it were, talk freely, referring to that handout, if that's all right. So I wanted to start by drawing your attention to something which seems to me to be a phenomenon with which we're very well aware in our everyday life, and that's the phenomenon of wishful thinking. You'll all recall that Freud, in one of his later works, talks about a young woman in Vienna who is introduced to the Archduke and dances with the Archduke, and the Archduke makes pleasant conversation with her, and she decides that the Archduke is going to marry her. And she does various sorts of things in order to foster this project, and she buys a dress, and she does various other sorts of things. And this is what we would call, I take it in normal parlance, an instance of wishful thinking. That is, the reason that she believes that the Archduke is going to marry her is that she would like that to be the case. It isn't that she has no evidence for this. She's got some evidence for it. After all, he did talk to her. That evidence is not sufficient. It's not what we would call good evidence for the conclusion, but there is some kind of evidence. Nevertheless, we would say that if the young woman goes home and makes practical attempts to organize her life around her belief that the Archduke is going to marry her, she would be doing something that we would find to be somehow cognitively deficient. We would say that she was engaged in wishful thinking. That is, we had thought that her wish that this might be the case has interfered with the normal processes of forming beliefs. So there's some notion, so we have some notion of what are the normal processes or the appropriate processes in which we should form our beliefs and form our preferences. And we also then have some notion of how it might be that in certain circumstances, wishes that we have might interfere with or influence that normal process of evaluating evidence and doing whatever it is we do to form our beliefs. And if the wish inappropriately influences the process of forming the belief, we say that it's been a case of wishful thinking. Now, of course, that presupposes that we have some idea of what it is for a process of forming belief to be normal, and it presupposes that we have some idea of what it means to say that the wish structure has inappropriately, as opposed to appropriately, influenced the process by which we generate beliefs. And this, in turn, can give rise to a certain theoretical attitude, which is plausible, but I think not in the final analysis tenable, namely to the idea that there is, on the one hand, cognitive processing. There's, on the one hand, some way in which we try to discover what the nature of the world is, and on the other hand, there are our wishes and preferences, and the two things are completely distinct from each other. So you might think that this presupposes that the two things are completely distinct from one another. That is, to speak of wishful thinking assumes this kind of model of what's going on. But it seems to me that it makes no such assumption. We can perfectly reasonably say that we can identify in some cases in which the wishes have inappropriately influenced the process of forming the belief. We can say that. We can say that in some cases it's been appropriate without either presupposing that the influences that wishes have on beliefs are always inappropriate, and also without having a general theory which tells us which ones are appropriate and which ones aren't appropriate. That is, it might well be the case that we can recognize error or we can recognize deviance, although we can't say in general what the natural, normal course of affair would be, compared with which we call it deviance. So we don't have to have a whole theory to start with. We can just focus on these things, and we can still say this was an instance of an inappropriate influence that was exercised here. Now, note, too, that when we speak of wishful thinking, we're not necessarily saying that the belief in question is false. The discussion of whether a certain belief is a belief that we hold because of wishful thinking is a discussion about the motivation for holding the belief, not a discussion about the correctness of the belief. I might well hold a belief because I want to hold that belief, and it might well be the case that some desire that I have has inappropriately caused me to hold this belief, and the belief might turn out to be right. I mean, it might well be that the Archduke comes and marries her. Still, she was holding a belief for wishful thinking, even if it happens to be the case. So wishful thinking refers to the process of the formation, not the correctness of the thing which is finally set upon. And now I want to suggest that one source of one instance of the way in which we are liable as human beings to engage in wishful thinking is that we tend also as human beings to want to see ourselves in a positive light. That is, a source of a lot of our wishful thoughts about the world can be connected, I think, with the desire we have to affirm ourselves, the desire to present ourselves in a good light. We do various sorts of things, and we describe what we've done in a way that makes those things look like the result of an admirable characteristic rather than a calculation. So we have this deep-seated need to tell ourselves stories that make us look good. However, it's also the case that wishful thinking need not be egotistical. That is, in the case that I described from Freud, the woman thinks that the Grand Duke, the Archduke, is going to marry her because she wants him to marry her. And so the desire is somehow a desire for something that's good for her. It's of course in principle possible that I might be engaged in a form of wishful thinking that did not have that clear and direct connection between the thing that I wish for and some benefit to myself. I might well, for example, strongly identify imaginatively with one of two children. And if I see two children are in a struggle with one another, I might wishfully think that the one is going to come out better than the other. And I might believe that A is going to come out better than B because I wish A to come out in a way that's better with B. And that might also be an instance of wishful thinking, although, as it were, the wish is not a wish that something good happened to me, at least not directly that kind of wish, but a wish that something good might happen to A. So in many cases, wishful thinking will be connected with a wish that I have that's self-related in a direct way, but it need not be. I can also, and I'm going to suggest that that's connected with the human possibility of identifying with other people. So if it happened to be my child rather than someone who is not my child, I might identify with the success of that child wishfully rather than the other person. So the structure of wishful thinking is also malleable. And it's malleable in a number of different ways. And there might be some kind of final self-related aspect to it, but it will not be necessarily directly a wish that something good happened to me. It might be a wish that something good happened to someone else as a result of my identifying with that person, for example. Now, I've started by talking about an individual instance of wishful thinking. But of course, corresponding to the individual cases, you might think there are collective cases too. It isn't just that I wish that something be the case because it reflects well on me, but it might also be a very deep fact about human beings that we wish to see ourselves in a certain way. We wish to be good people, we wish to be seen to be good people, we might have various wishes about ourselves, and those wishes might interfere with our ability to perceive certain things about ourselves, or interfere with the possibility that a society has to think clearly about itself in a way that's somewhat similar to the way in which the desire on the part of the young woman interfered with her ability to see that the Grand Duke was simply being polite and not actually interested in marrying her. So groups too can engage in wishful thinking, and groups too can wish to think well of themselves. And I merely point out that it isn't out of the question to think that in many cases these forms of groups' desires to think well of themselves might be even more difficult to deal with than the cases of individuals wanting to think well about themselves. Because of course groups have at their disposal all sorts of social psychological mechanisms for enforcing conformity, which I don't have in my own case. It makes a big difference whether I would like to think well about myself, or I am a member of a group, and the group has a newspaper, and everyone in the newspaper says, this is the right way to think about things. You know, we have the empire, and, Britain, I mean, we have the empire, we had the empire, and etc., and it was a good thing, etc., etc., etc. So the forms for reinforcing that kind of wishful thinking on a collective level might make them even more difficult to shift than in the case of individuals. I'm saying that's an open empirical question. I'm not saying, I don't want to prejudice that in any way. Now I want to distinguish wishful thinking from two other things with which you might connect it, but from which I think it should be distinguished. And the first thing I want to distinguish it from is ideology. That is, I want to say that the basic intuition behind the old concept that people used to have of ideology was the intuition that a society was a self-reproducing mechanism of a kind. That is, a society wasn't just a group of people, it wasn't just a group of people who were trying to do something together, it was a group that was trying, among other things, to reproduce its own structure, reproduce its own values through time. And that this is an important component of what it is to be a society. It's a continuing enterprise through time, which is attempting to maintain itself through time as having a certain kind of identity. And I want to suggest that to think about ideology is to think about one of the ways in which such a process of maintaining oneself through time might be effected. Namely, that one of the ways in which a society might reproduce itself in time is to have people, to secrete around itself certain conceptions that have the property that if enough people believe in those conceptions, believing in those conceptions on the part of a large number of people will contribute to allowing the society to go on and do the sorts of things that it has done in the past. And so concepts like the particular concept of justice you have, the particular kind of notion of merit that you have, I would say the particular conception of rights you have, can be seen as ideological because they can be seen as concepts, the basic function of which, or they can be seen as being concepts, part of the function of which is to allow the society to reproduce itself smoothly. And such concepts are characteristically more or less accepted by people, even though they don't necessarily benefit those people directly. And that's what I want to say is one of the differences in structure between a concept of ideology and a concept of wishful thinking. Characteristically, in the case of wishful thinking, I will think about something, I will have a wish that's connected to my own benefit or connected to the benefit of someone with whom I identify. Characteristically, in the case of an ideological conception, the ideological conception will be one that I accept despite the fact that accepting that conception is not in itself connected with satisfying any interest that I have. Characteristically, it will satisfy the interest of some other group. So in the traditional Marxist version, it isn't that the members of the proletariat accept a certain ideology because it benefits them. In fact, they accept a certain form of ideological thought, despite the fact that accepting that form of thought benefits a completely different group in society. So owners, for example, benefit from the concept of a property right more than non-owners do. And so now I want to say that the basic concept of ideology is connected with the notion of interest, whereas the concept of wishful thinking is connected not so much with interest as with desire. So a wishful thought is a thought that satisfies my desire. An ideology is a conception that functions to support someone's interest. And so I want to say that means that there is, at least prima facie, rather a difference between these two things. I want to distinguish, of course, very strongly between a desire, an interest, and a need, right? Where a desire is some kind of psychological entity. It has something to do with what particular people or particular groups of people want. It's a motivational property of things. An interest is a theoretically specified, abstract notion of what it would be good for a person. So I might desire what is in my interest, but I might not desire what's in my interest. There might be all sorts of things that were in my interest that I didn't actually desire. And there might be all sorts of things that I desire that were not in my interest. So interest is connected with some abstract specification of that which is good. Desire is connected with something that actually motivates me in a particular way. And I want to distinguish both of those from the concept of a need. The concept of a need is the concept not of something that I desire, and not even of something that's in my interest. Something that's in my interest is something which would be good for me. But the notion of a need is a kind of negative concept. That is, a need is something without the satisfaction of which I will malfunction in some way. So the structure of those three things is very different. Desire, interest, need. One can't just smooth them together. And what I essentially want to say is wishful thinking is connected more with the realm of desire. That is, it starts from what we want and our wishes and how our wishes affect what we think. The concept of ideology, as it were, doesn't start from within. It doesn't start from the internal motivation of people. It starts from a systemic analysis of what would be in whose benefit or in whose interest. And so they refer to two different dimensions. Now, that of course overlooks the fact that the most important ideologies and the ones that are successful, the ones that are most successful, are ones that do connect those two different things. So I'm saying they're analytically distinct, but the kinds of ideologies that are most successful are ideologies that in fact connect those two things that are analytically distinct. That is, the most successful kinds of ideologies are ideologies which mobilize our self-love or our imaginative desires or our wishful thinking, and mobilize that to cause us to accept certain theoretical conceptions that have the property of being more connected with the interests of other people than with our own interests. So I would like to think of myself in a good light. I desire to think of myself as being a good person. And that's so I have that desire, and say I was living in the 19th century in Britain and I'd have a certain ideology of imperialism, and I might say I'll be a good subject of Her Majesty provided I support this imperialist project. And so you get a connection between those two things. And the most interesting cases and the most successful ones are ones that connect those two things. And therefore, it's also extremely important to analyze how that connection works in concrete cases. So that's one thing I want to distinguish, wishful thinking and ideologies. Then I want to say there's a third thing, which is what you might think of as, it's something that doesn't really have a name. It's the sort of thing that Foucault analyzes. Namely, it's what he calls socially self-evident identities. That is, Foucault thinks that if you think about human societies, another thing that you'll notice is people don't only have forms of wishful thinking, and they also don't only have forms of ideological thinking, but we all accept certain kinds of stereotypes. We all take certain connections between things to be natural or rational or well-grounded, or we take certain things to go together naturally. So we think that democracy and liberalism, as it were, form a natural unit. Or in Foucault's case, he thinks that people had conceptions like the conception of the homosexual, which was the idea that certain different character traits came together and fit together naturally. Or we think that Catholicism is what it presents itself to be, namely a coherent, internally coherent single structure. Catholicism is one thing. And now, and so it has the property of putting together different things, and those different things are put together with the social appearance of being self-evidently things that belong together. So it's self-evidently the case that if you believe in the infallibility of the Pope and you believe in monogamous marriage, you will also believe in prohibition on abortion. They're different things, but they belong together somehow. And they belong together as a kind of self-evident unit. And now Foucault, but other people before him, have said that there's a task, which is the task he calls the task of genealogy, and that's the task of giving a kind of historical account of the way in which these things which seem to be obvious synthetic units, in which different things that belong together naturally or belong together rationally, there's a historical account in which you show that which those things which look as if they naturally fit together actually do not naturally or normally or rationally fit together. You tell the story of the way in which the different elements that are put together in a certain kind of social identity originally had different origins, had a different history, were in fact perhaps incompatible with each other, and you tell the history of the way in which those different elements came together to form the single unitary thing. I mean, we all know that the doctrine of the prohibition on abortion doesn't get established in Catholicism until everybody should know, until the Middle Ages, right? In the early church, there's no discussion of this, and it gets going as a result of Thomas Aquinas's views about various sorts of things. So if you put Thomas Aquinas into the equation, then you get a certain kind of thing. But so genealogy tells this story, and it tells the story of how these elements are distinct, and also it tells the story of how they come together, but it tells the story of how and why they come together in a contingent way. There's nothing natural about them. There's a contingent conjunction of them, and the history of their coming together is a history in which there are both some rational but also some power-related elements. Those elements come together not because they go together naturally, not because they go together rationally, but because there are powerful institutions that are operating that pull them together, a series of institutions that pull them together. And the operations of those institutions are not, as it were, merely exercises of power, but they're exercises of a funny combination of power with a kind of rationality. And what Foucault says is if you then do a genealogy of these things, like contemporary Catholicism or the things he was interested in, the delinquent or the frigid woman or the homosexual, if you do the genealogies of these things, it isn't that you'll, as it were, refute anything. It isn't that you'll refute anything. It's rather that you will cause people to see that what they thought were self-evidently, elements that self-evidently held together, did not have the property of naturally or self-evidently belonging together at all. That the appearance, so you destroy the appearance of obviousness of the conjunction. Now, you can destroy the appearance of obviousness of the conjunction and still hold to the conjunction. You can say, yes, it's true, those two things came together through this accidental process. But that's great, that's fine. That will be sufficient as a result of the genealogy, because you no longer take them to be for granted. You then, of course, have to give a reason, presumably, for why they should be held together. But giving a reason for why they have to hold together is different from assuming as an obvious fact that they must necessarily go together. So, okay. And now there's an obvious connection between this kind of wishful thinking and ideology, and wishful thinking, ideology, and these socially established identities. Now, I'm on the second page of my handout. So what's the relation of all of this to politics? I want to suggest that if you look at the political and social world in the above way, that is, if you look at the political and social world, you see these three things out there: ideological thinking, wishful thinking, and these things which are the self-evident forms of socially accepted forms of identity. If you see those things out there, and you see them as, roughly speaking, somehow potentially problematic, you don't see the social world as natural. You don't see the social world as obviously good. You don't think that we naturally think about the world in a healthy way. You think that there are potentially grave problems about the way we think of the world. Potentially, it might be the case that we're being wishful in thinking about the world, the social world in particular. Potentially, it might be the case that we're thinking about the social world or the political world in a way that's ideologically determined. Potentially, we might be thinking about the world in terms of apparently self-evident unitary categories which turn out on historical inspection to be no such thing. If you think that's a danger there, then you're unlikely, it seems to me, to approach political philosophy in the way in which a lot of political philosophers, contemporary political philosophers, approach the subject. That is, you'll be unlikely to approach the subject by thinking that the way to go about it is to think about what moral intuitions we have. So, what do we think justice is? Let's think about what we think justice is. And now let's get a coherent theory of justice. And then let's apply the theory of justice to the world. And that's the right way to go about it. You think, what human rights do we have? Let's think about that. And then let's apply it. That's not going to be a way of going about, that order of going about thinking about the world is not going to recommend itself to you if you think that there's a possibility that these concepts like justice or human rights or any of these things might conceivably be bad starting points for getting a cognitive grasp on the world, because they might be forms of wishful thinking, they might be forms of ideological thinking, and they might be forms of these apparently self-evident unitary constructions which, however, on historical reflection turn out to have nothing unitary about them at all. If you think that's a possibility, you're unlikely to go down the road. That road. As you know, just this example, as you know, the ancients thought that it was absolutely intuitively clear that the most unjust thing in the world would be to treat a slave well. Because obviously justice required that you treated everyone equally. Namely, every slave as like every other slave, and every free person as like every other free person. And slaves and free persons were obviously distinct, and so therefore it was obviously unjust to treat a slave like a free person. Just as it was obviously unjust to treat a woman in the way you treat a man. So for them, if they start from the intuition of what is just, their intuition of what is just is, one thing is just for women, one thing is just for men, one way of treating slaves is, one way of treating people is just if it's a slave, one way of treating it is a person. And whereas we're not going to if you think about some of these cases historically, you're not going to be very likely to assume that our intuitions about what is just and what is unjust, if they're unreflectively accepted, have any greater reliability than what we take to be the reliability of their intuitions about it. You're going to think that you might start in a different way. You might not start from the intuitions, but you might start by thinking about the society, thinking about the way in which different conceptions play a role in that society, and thinking historically about where our intuitions came from and where the concepts we use came from. Now, I'm on my Roman 4 on the second page. So I use this term, which I made a mistake in using it, I think, but it's too late now. I use the term realism to refer to kind of another approach to political philosophy. And I use the term to refer to a kind of way of approaching political philosophy that's reflective about those three dimensions. So a realistic political philosophy is one that tries to dispense with wishful thinking. A realistic political philosophy is one that tries to analyze ideologies and not be caught up in ideological illusions. And a realistic political philosophy is a political philosophy that tries to not to take the self-evident stereotypes that are around at face value and argue from them, but tries to see what lies behind them. Now, unfortunately, realism is one of those words like liberalism that means anything to anybody, and I made a big mistake in using the term. But anyway, I've used it now, and I just want to distinguish three different ways in which people have used the term realism, and so that it becomes clear what ways I don't mean and what way I do mean. First, there's a philosopher's usage of the term realism, which we won't go into, which is to refer to a certain metaphysical thesis or to refer to a certain epistemological thesis. That is, a realist is a person who thinks that we have some kind of direct cognitive contact with the real world. That has nothing to do with the realism I'm interested in. I'm not interested in that. Second, this is a more interesting one, there's a use of realism in the international relations literature. And in international relations, realism has a particular clear meaning. Usually, I think the people in this literature think of themselves as opposing liberalism. So the way they cut up the ideological space is there are liberals and there are realists. And the realist is a person who thinks basically realism either has a descriptive or it has a normative version, or it has both of them. And the descriptive version is a version about how you should try to explain what states do. And basically that says that states essentially pursue the satisfaction of their material interests and power, the increase of their power. That's what they do. And therefore, if you want to explain what happens in the international world, the explanation of why state A did that will be an explanation that will not refer in the first instance to the fact that that was a just thing to do, but it will refer to the fact that state A or the agents involved in directing state A thought that by doing that they would increase their power or they would satisfy their material interests. So it's a thesis about what the proper form of explanation is. Don't explain why they invaded Iraq by references to some democracy. Explain it by reference to what was really going on, and that will always turn out to be something having to do with concrete interest, material interest, and something having to do with the expansion of power. That's a way in which the international literature uses, the international relation literature uses the term. And then there's a normative version of that. That's the explanatory version. The normative version is not only never explain things except by reference to this, but that's a good thing. You know, you as a politician, your job as a politician is not to satisfy your own moral requirements. If you are elected as a politician, you're not there, as it were, to save your own conscience. You're there to do what is politically required, and what is politically required is to do what is necessary in order to advance the material interests of the people whom you represent, and what is necessary to increase the power of the people you represent in addition. So that's the international relations sense of this. Okay. Now the third use of the sense of the term realism is realism as opposed to utopianism. There too, a realist is a person who has a certain second-order principle, which is the principle of only doing those things which are in principle doable at the time. That's what a realist does. A realist is a person who thinks only do those things which are doable, only try to do those things which are doable. Or there's an even stronger version of that. Only aspire to do those things which are actually doable in the circumstance. And a utopian is anyone else. Now, I merely point out that both of these usages, that is both the international relations usage and the realism usage, depend on a very, very strong set of further assumptions. For example, the further assumption that you can distinguish between what is in my material interest and something else, or what will actually increase my power and what will not. If those distinctions are not clear, it's not clear that realism, in the second sense, makes a lot of sense. If certain if being seen to be realizing certain ideal values is itself a way of increasing one's power in the political world, then this whole way of talking about it doesn't make sense. Similarly, in the case of realism as opposed to utopianism, what does being doable mean? Does being doable mean doable by me, by Raymond? Now, if I'm a realist, only if I do what's doable by me, I'd be dead. I'd be dead very soon. Does wanting to do what is doable by me mean by me and my friends, by me and the other people who are citizens of the United Kingdom, by me and the other people in the European Union? So what does doable mean? Does it mean doable at the moment, doable in the long run, doable by whom, doable under what circumstances? So again, the distinction between realism and utopianism depends on having a relatively clear idea of what doable by whom in what situation is. And of course it's not obvious that that is at all a determinate concept, because partly because what is doable by me depends in part on what I think I can do. And so the idea that I can distinguish between what's doable by, the idea that I can, as it were, first of all decide what's doable by me, and then decide what I will aspire to do, doesn't make a lot of sense. If what I can do, what's doable by me, depends in part on what I want to do. So that distinction doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense too. So the philosopher's uses of realism, the international relations use of realism, and the realism as opposed to utopianism. Three versions of the term of the use of the term realism. Now, my use of the term realist isn't either of any of those, right? My use of realism is not as the opposite of utopianism, but as the opposite of wishful thinking. That is, I'm saying you're a realist if you don't engage in wishful thinking. But of course, to be against wishful thinking is not to be against having wishes. I mean, I'm not saying that, as it were, wishes are not important, or imaginative aspirations are not important. What I'm saying is, it would behoove you very much not to allow uncontrolled not to allow your wishes in uncontrolled ways to dictate to you what you believe is the case. That's completely compatible with thinking that wishing is perfectly fine, and even utopian wishing is completely fine. So I don't use it in the philosopher's sense, I don't use it in the international relations sense, and I don't use it in the way in which it's opposed to utopianism. Okay, now, just at the end, 3 objections to this, and 2 of them I think are non-starters, and the third is an objection, so to speak, not to me, but to life. And so I think that's all right. The first objection is there's no such thing as completely non-wishful thinking, because all thinking somehow, to make sense, must be embedded in some context of human desires, even to make sense. So there isn't any such thing as non-wishful thinking. All thinking has to have a kind of projective component. It has to be, in some sense, go beyond what's given. It can't otherwise operate. And if this is unavoidable, then the notion of a completely realist view is incoherent. But to this, I'm afraid I just have a kind of, this is not a philosophical reply, this is just a kind of common sense reply. So we're all eventually going to die. Does this mean it makes no sense to try to cure the sick? I mean, even if one grants that, there's some very basic level at which we couldn't realistically attempt to gain cognition about the world if that cognition was not embedded in a larger context, which was a larger context which had a voluntative component. Even if we grant that in general, it doesn't follow that in every particular case it might not be the case that we could say that yes, in general you couldn't think about the world at all unless you wanted, for example, to act in the world. That's true in general. But still, you, Fräulein so-and-so, you think that the Archduke is going to marry you because of this. So I want to distinguish there between the global, a global account of this and the particular account you might give in a particular case. And I want to say that that seems to me to be sufficient to go on with this. It might be impossible for me ever to rid myself completely of wishful thinking, but it doesn't follow from that that I shouldn't make any attempt ever to control what it is that I think about the world and what I believe about it. Second objection is excessive versions of realism are ideologically motivated, and they amount to no more than a call for people to reduce their aspirations and not disturb the status quo. That is, this is a kind of objection that you'll find again and again. The people who call for realism are not actually calling for you to get a correct understanding of the world. They're actually telling you to reduce your desires. Don't want so much. Keep your desires as minimal as possible, and that's something which you can then connect with various interests that people in power might have or might not. Now, this might sometimes be true, but again, look at the instance that I cite above. Rejecting wishful thinking doesn't necessarily mean arguing for a diminution of desire, but only for a distinction between desire and reality. So I can perfectly well say, don't engage in wishful thinking, without saying that it follows from that you should reduce the level of your desire or the level of your aspiration. They are two different things, it seems to me. So neither of them seems to me to go anywhere. The third one, surely wishful thinking is sometimes something positive, motivating us to do valuable things that we would otherwise not find it in ourselves to do. And what I want to say to that is that's no doubt correct. And that politics requires some sense of when it is the case and when it's not. That is, from the fact that it's sometimes the case, it doesn't follow that it's always the case. And it seems to be one of the parts of politics is to find out when it is the case and when it isn't the case. So that's not an argument, as it were, against me. That's just an expression of your desire, if you have such a desire, to have everything nicely and neatly separated into categories. And Lenin famously said, anyone who wanted a happy life, a quiet life, made a big mistake being born in the 20th century. And so I would say equally, if you want to have a hard and fast criterion for when it's right to wish for something and when it's not right to wish for something, you want a hard and fast criterion for that, you've been born as the member of the wrong species. I don't think one has to solve that as a question. That's part of the human condition. It's not an objection to a particular view. So this is not a general argument against trying to control our tendency to wishful thinking. So, that's 50 minutes. That was what I was asked to talk for. So that's what I prepared. So thank you for listening.